everybody, it's me, Steve Schnee, the CD Junkie. On this episode of CD Junkie, I'm going to be talking about a band that I've loved for, over 40 years now. And you probably know them by one huge hit. And of course, the huge hit that I'm talking about is a song called Driver's Seat. That's right, I am talking about SNIFF N the Tears, a fantastic band. I usually like to start these videos out by telling you how I got into the band, and that was basically because Driver's Seat. I remember the album came out, Fickle Heart, 1978, and I remember seeing it on the shelf and thinking, oh, that looks pretty cool. Nice, cool artwork. And then somewhere along the line, probably within the next week or so, I heard the song Driver's Seat, which was just an instant classic. It got played on new wave radio, it got played on FM radio, it got played on AM radio, and of course later on got played on video channels and stuff, but they weren't around back then. But Driver's Seat was a big hit. Fickle Heart came out in 1978. Was there a song as catchy as Driver's Seat? Not really, but there was a lot of great songs on the album. Lead singer, songwriter Paul Roberts, who also does the artwork, by the way, an incredible artist in both music and painting. Boy, would I love to own one of his original pieces of art. But and you'll see as I go through just how great he is. But I remember thinking, when listening to the album, Paul Roberts never really tried to rewrite Driver's Seat. He was writing these songs. They're coming from a folkier place, like let's say more influenced by Bob Dylan than they were the Beatles. So they were different from what I was used to. Back then in 78, I was buying, punk, power pop, synth pop, whatever was out. And so it was different, but I loved it all the same because, I love music. I think everybody knows that by now. But I loved it. And unfortunately, there wasn't any other big hits on it, but still, it was a wonderful debut album. And it was a great slab of folk rock mixed with maybe a tiny little bit of new wave energy, but it was really sort of based in, 60s type songwriting. And so Fickle Heart, 1978, that was the first album. 1980, out comes the second album called The Game's Up. Wonderful artwork again. I bought that when it came out. Still no rewrite of Driver's Seat. See, which I love that kind of stuff. When a band comes out with a big hit, the label's always saying, write another one, just like that. And Paul Roberts is saying, hey, I'm writing the songs I want to write. And another batch of cool classic SNIFF N the Tears tracks there. Lots of great sort of folk influence stuff. SNIFF N the Tears is one of those bands you need 2, 3, 4 listens, and then the songs just really sort of sink in and clutch you, and then they never let go. So they're one of those kind of bands. If you're looking for just like Driver's Seat, first time listen, I'm going to love it, you're not going to get that. These are albums that are growers, but they stay longer. And because of that, they're kind of timeless. They have their own personality. Now, speaking of new wave, 1981 comes around, and there's a whole new band behind him. Well, most of the new band. Nick South on bass, and Jamie Lane on drums, and Les Davidson on guitar. I'm not going to remember everybody's name, so I apologize to all the SNIFF N the Tears band members. I want to get through this as quick as possible. But this is the first album that Les Davidson was on, and he actually ended up playing a big part throughout the entire career. And of course, Nick South later joined Times UK and other bands. But this album here was closer to like a new wavy sound. It was still that classic Paul Roberts vocals and songwriting. The songs were a little poppier, and the production was a little new wavier. So, there was more like reverb and, synth sounds, and it's not a synth pop album by any means, but obviously they must have been going for maybe, hey, let's make it a little more commercial sounding than the last album. And it's full of great songs. Now there's a song on the album called The Driving Beat. Now you think to yourself, he rewrote Driver's Seat. Nah, not Paul Roberts. No, he stuck to his guns, and The Driving Beat's just a great little rock and roll folk number with some new wavy sounds. Really, really cool album. This was probably my favorite as a full album up to this point. But then, before I get into the next album, I wanted to let you know that just last year, 2020, they reissued the album. They completely remixed it, and they added a few bonus tracks. And the remix, what it does is it takes away those 80s elements and it brings up the elements of that classic sound of the first two albums. So it's more of a human-based sound. The vocals are way up. This really sounds like sort of the logical progression from the Game's Up as opposed to that new wave thing. So I say any fan needs to hang on to this, but also get the new remix because it's definitely worth it. Gives the whole album a whole new feel. The songs are just as magical, but you're listening to them in a whole new exciting way. So definitely check that out. 1982 comes around and Red Blue Divide. This is more kind of a new wavy type sound to it. I love it, but I love SNIFF N the Tears. Folk rock influences in a new wave world, and some people couldn't handle that. They either wanted Culture Club or they wanted more Driver's Seat. But yeah, this was a good album. But unfortunately, this was the last SNIFF N the Tears album. Now, of course, Paul Roberts, he continued in sort of a more quiet, folkier way, but it still had that SNIFF N the Tears sound to it, because his voice is very distinctive. This was his first solo album called City Without Walls, came out in 1985. And it actually is a really good album. It does have some of the SNIFF N the Tears players on it. So you can pretend it's a SNIFF N the Tears album if you want, but it's actually a Paul Roberts solo album, City Without Walls, 1985. Now in 1987, out comes the second Paul Roberts solo album, Kettle Drum Blues. Now there's something about these two albums that would be important in the future. He started working with a keyboard player by the name of, and I'm probably going to screw this up, Robin Langridge. And Robin would essentially be on every album after these. So Robin Langridge on keyboards is just as important to Paul Roberts' music as Les Davidson was on guitar. Now, surprisingly enough, out comes a brand new SNIFF N the Tears album in 1992 called No Damage Done. This continued the sound of the previous Paul Roberts albums with a little bit more SNIFF N the Tears sound to it. Still a great batch of songs. Les Davidson is there. Robin Langridge is there. And unsurprisingly enough, they went back later and they remixed that album, and there is the new mix of the album. So either way, you're going to enjoy it. Of course, me being the music nerd, I need to have both versions. 8 years later, in the year 2000, out comes the album Underground. This is an album that continues, I think it's got more like programmed drum beats and stuff, but it's still those great Paul Roberts folk rock influenced melodies, and still his voice is just very distinctive. His songwriting is distinctive. He's just a great artist, very, very much overlooked. But it would take 11 years before the next album came out, and that was Downstream in 2011. More classic Paul Roberts songwriting, and really, really, all these SNIFF N the Tears albums, they're not these big commercial things, but if you love SNIFF N the Tears and you love albums just filled with great songs, you're definitely going to want to check out that as well. Then it would take another 6 years before Random Elements was released. This is just a wonderful album, but it's the return of Nick South, who hadn't played, I don't think, on any SNIFF N the Tears album as a quote-unquote full-time member since Red Blue Divide. So Nick South is on here, Robin Langridge is on here, Les Davidson is on here, and Paul Roberts, of course, the singer-songwriter. Fantastic album, and that came out in 2017. In 2020, after playing some live acoustic gigs, Paul Roberts and Les Davidson went in and they recorded an acoustic album. This is not live, but it's live in the studio, live acoustic. And they tackle some of SNIFF N the Tears' finest tracks. Just look at those tracks right there. It's great because Paul Roberts hasn't lost that voice. The songs still sound great. When preparing for this, I went back and I was listening to a lot of the stuff, and most of the stuff is really absolutely timeless. And I think the way that people create timeless music is they're not writing for modern times, the time that they're in. They're writing from what they know from the past. They're drawing from the past. So they're taking the past into the present, and so it's not sounding like anything else that's going on around them. And in essence, they're creating something that remains timeless. So all of SNIFF N the Tears albums are timeless, even if it's got that sort of new wavy sound like on the original mix of Love Action and Red Blue Divide. And it's absolutely fabulous. Now, I have to admit, I'm not going to lie here. One of these albums was remixed, and I don't know which one, and I don't know how to get a hold of the remixed version. But anyway, I'm going to try to find the link. I interviewed Paul Roberts a few years ago for my podcast, Beach Blanket Fort Bingo. We talked about his then current album, Random Elements, and of course the SNIFF N the Tears back catalog. I'm hoping, maybe one day he'll agree to do a Zoom interview now that Beach Blanket Fort Bingo has moved over to the video form. So if you're catching this video on my YouTube channel, go back and search and you'll see some of my Beach Blanket Fort Bingo Zoom video interviews. And those are always fun to do. Maybe I can get Paul Roberts to do one. I've got more coming up. Anyway, that is it for this video on SNIFF N the Tears. I really appreciate you sitting around allowing me to talk about this great band, maybe reminding you or encouraging you to go back and dig into their catalog. I really appreciate your time. Remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, and to ring that bell for future notifications. And until the next time, remember me, I'm Steve Schnee, the CD Junkie.